Wanted to just make a quick video for you guys about sexual addiction and deceitful desires. Just picking up in Ephesians 4:22, you were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires. And when I think about deceitful desires, I think about desires that are actually deceitful ones, which to me means that you can't take these desires that we're talking about at surface value. They are intrinsically, inherently deceitful, which means you have to look beneath the desire to find out what's underneath the desire that it's actually deceiving you about. So, I think the most important thing about deceitful desires is escapism. And when you think about sexual temptation and sexual fantasy, a sexual fantasy world, you have to think about escapism, and that what a fantasy is all about escaping reality. Now, what 2 Corinthians 10:4-5 talks about is that the Apostle Paul is saying that the weapons of his warfare are not carnal or not physical, but they're spiritual, and they actually are for breaking down strongholds and taking thoughts captive to the obedience of Christ. And so what I want to talk about right now in this quick little video, it's only going to take a few minutes, is just about how to take sexual fantasy captive. The first step to taking sexual fantasy captive and learning how to take these thoughts captive is different from what the church and what sermons usually talk about when they talk about taking thoughts captive. I'm not talking about sort of a willpower or some kind of mind control, but I'm talking about the importance of identifying what your thoughts really are. Before you can take a thought captive, you have to actually identify what it is. And I think the important thing about sexual fantasy and sexual thoughts is that usually there are deeper things at stake than just the sexual thought that you're having on the surface. I'm going to give you some examples here, and they're going to be kind of graphic. So, you know, if you're going to do a sermon about this, I don't know how graphic you want to be. But for instance, let's talk about having a sexual fantasy about a woman, whether she's a prostitute, whether she's an image on the screen, maybe a person at work, an illicit relationship, an image in a magazine or a DVD. There are some key elements that are always present in a sexual fantasy. And here is what they are. If you think about a sexual fantasy, and we've all had them, think about what that fantasy is like on the inside. For instance, usually the woman you're fantasizing about affirms you. She affirms that you're strong, she affirms that you're sexual, she affirms that you're attractive, which meets your longing for affirmation. She also wants you. She desires you in that fantasy, usually. She's saying things that express her desire for you, which really talks about your longing to be loved. She accepts your advances. When in your fantasy world, when you're thinking about what you would do to her or how you would approach her or what you would say to her, the woman in your fantasy world accepts you and accepts your advances, which really talks about your longing to be accepted, your longing to be received, and your fear of rejection. For me, you know, usually a sexual fantasy feels good, and it actually feels a lot better than whatever feeling I'm currently feeling, which talks about a desire to escape circumstances, a desire to escape feelings, a desire to escape pain, stress, anxiety, etc. Another thing about a sexual fantasy is she's willingly undressing for me, or is undressing me and wanting to do that. And for me, that meets a longing for intimacy and a closeness with others. And there's lots of other deeper feelings that are at stake when you're talking about a sexual fantasy. So the first step in how to take sexual fantasy captive is to identify the deeper things that you're looking for in your lust for illicit sex, for pornography, prostitutes, whatever it is. Identifying the deeper things. Now the second thing to take sexual fantasy captive is to surrender to God, like James 4 verse 7 talks about. Submit yourself to God. And in this is the point where, if it's a sexual issue, internet filter software comes up, accountability groups, cutting off affairs come in. But there's even a deeper surrender there. The deeper surrender is saying to God, God, I am willing to surrender my escape from my life and to live in reality. You have to surrender up the sexual fantasy and actually be willing to stay in reality. There's actions that you have to take to do that, but it's also an internal surrender. But without, just a plain surrender without the next step really doesn't go deep enough to really fixing the problem, which is strengthening your intimacy with the Lord. This is where James 4 verse 8 talks about, draw near to God and he will draw near to you. Your relationship with God can be the one to meet your deepest needs. And then once you've identified the deeper need, whether it's a longing for acceptance or affirmation, whether it's a fear of rejection, whether it's a longing for intimacy and closeness, whether it's a longing to be loved, this is a time to go to the Lord in prayer and worship and to allow God to fulfill those needs and allow the Lord to be the one to meet the deepest needs. And really, that's the only way that I believe sexual temptation can really be beaten. Without that, it's like, I always talk about, it's like having somebody with a ice cream cone in front of their face, looking straight at it and saying, don't eat it, 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 don't eat it. That's what we're telling people to do with their sexual desires, because these sexual fantasies are based on real needs. The real needs of affirmation, of acceptance, of love, of intimacy. These are real needs that God implanted in us. You can't ignore those needs. The only thing you can do is learn to meet them in your relationship with God instead of in the fantasy world. And I love what God says in Jeremiah 2 verse 13. He says, my people have committed two sins. One is they have forsaken me, the spring of living water. And two, they've made themselves broken cisterns that cannot hold water. And what God is saying there is, there's only two sins. One is forsaking him, and two is building yourself a cistern and trying to suck some kind of sustenance out of this dry, dead thing. And the only way that we can beat the power of sexual fantasy and sexual compulsive behavior is to have a greater yes in our hearts to the Lord, not just to say more no, more no, more no. So this is what I encourage anybody dealing with a compulsive issue of sexual compulsive thoughts, or sexually compulsive behavior. It's kind of a basic 3-step thing, but I guarantee that these 3 steps, I've seen a lot of guys be transformed by following these 3 steps, by identifying the deeper longings that are beneath their sexual fantasy, by surrendering those things to God, and by strengthening their intimacy with the Lord and going to God to get those needs met. And God really can meet those needs. That's the gospel. That's who He is. If we don't believe that, then we might as well throw in our towels. But I believe it, and I'm experiencing it, that God meets the deepest needs of our souls. And once those deep needs begin to actually be met, the sexually compulsive thoughts begin to weaken and become a lot less difficult to resist.